Russian troops during World War II laid siege and destroyed Budapest, Hungary. The city became occupied by strong-armed communists. Stay tuned to hear about one boy and his family and their life and escape from behind the Iron Curtain.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
The beautiful capital city had been surrounded by Russian troops for 3 months. German and Hungarian troops within had been decimated. The city was in ruins. What a time. Then began the Russian occupation. Our guest, Nicholas Sabo, will tell us about that time and how his family planned and executed their escape. Hello, Nick. Thanks for coming once again to tell us more of the saga of your life during that time. And what age were you when all this began?
I was 14 at that time.
Okay. Now, Hungary had been under siege for 3 months by the Russians, so no food was getting in during that time. And I know that your family was a wealthy family, and your father had been very foresighted and laid aside food and supplies for hopefully the duration of that time, but many people didn't have the food. And when did food actually start coming back into the stores?
Well, the siege ended on February 11th when the last German troops were eliminated. Up to the 10th of February, there were 44,000 German troops holed up in a castle. And then the German general decided to break out. And of the 44,000, only 700 managed to get out and reach the German lines west of Budapest. Now, food started coming in slowly but surely about 2-3 weeks after February 11th. And in the meantime, it was very scarce.
What kind of food did you have stored in your home there?
We had the big staple was dried beans. We had a big sack of dried beans, and we ate those for days and days on end. But that's very nutritious. But we also had flour. We could bake bread and so on. And we even had some canned meat. But that was getting a little bit spoiled after a while.
The stores began getting some food in then, and I know there were long bread lines. And
right.
How did?
Well, bread lines were the first things that opened up. And what was interesting about it is these bread lines just went on for blocks because people wanted to stay. And it was a sort of an understanding that people with infants would go ahead of the line. And of course what happened is that then pretty soon these infants were rented out in exchange for food.
Mm-hmm. What about the power? There couldn't have been any electricity or gas or anything.
Right. All utilities were cut off with the exception of water in our particular house.
Well, now, there were dead bodies on the street. I've seen pictures, and you've told me previous conversations about that. I guess some starved, some froze, and maybe some had been hurt by the Russian soldiers. But you were fortunate that, again, being a wealthy family, your father had had occupied this 8-story apartment building for a portion of his corporate offices for his factory. And he had moved you and some of the executives in there to live during this time. So it was a pretty strong building, but it did incur some damage, didn't it?
Yes, yes. We occupied the second floor of the building. My father's company occupied it. And so his senior executives were all with us. They had moved in there. Now, the house, the apartment house, it's 8 stories, it was hit by 5 different shells. And one of them was a large shell, what they call 21 centimeter. That's a larger field artillery piece. So the front entrance was totally demolished. There was just a big hole there. And then by coincidence, the back entrance was hit by another shell and was destroyed. In addition to that, there were 3 more mortars that hit the house, but being a strong building, it didn't really demolish it.
There were problems with the Russian soldiers then just going in people's houses all over the place, going inside and looting, and I guess even when people were home, raping and demanding things.
Yes. You see, what happened is that, and we didn't know it at that time, but apparently the Russian High Command basically allowed anything to happen. They did not take any disciplinary measures against their soldiers. And that was the worst part of it. We had to make sure that, for instance, my sister, who was 17 at that time, that she wouldn't be raped. It was a difficult operation to hide her all the time.
How often would they come in your house?
Well, at the beginning, they would come several times a day. Okay, and then later on, they would. There were fewer then because the troops were engaged somewhere else.
What were they looking for when they came in?
They were actually looking for antibiotics, sulfa drugs, because many of them had venereal disease. And they were also looking for jewelry, and they were looking for, at the beginning, valuables. Subsequently,
There's nothing left, I suppose.
well, that's right. That wasn't it. But then, a new thing came. Since the Russians encouraged looting by allowing the soldiers to send packages home, and Russia was so short on clothing, they would take clothing. One particularly sad situation was that after, about 6 months or a year after the siege, and when things were already straightening out, I remember that a bus coming back from in the evening from the opera had all these people dressed up fancily, and the Russians hijacked the bus, and they basically had everybody strip their clothes down to the underwear, they took away their shoes, and then sent them on the way. And they just wanted the valuable, meaning the clothing.
Oh my goodness. Well, there were all kinds of people in there at that time. There were the Russian soldiers, the communists, and then there had been, prior to the siege, there had been a lot of German people who were living in Hungary, many of them Nazis, and Jews, and then after the communists came back, didn't the Bolsheviks return? Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's right. In 1919, right after World War Hungary had a revolution, a communist revolution, which was then driven out by Admiral Horthy. But the Bolsheviks who produced that revolution in 1920 fled to Russia. And then in 1945, when the Russians came in, they came back, and of course they were allied with the Russians and so on. But they all spoke Hungarian, and they were Hungarians.
Did a lot of the Hungarian people become communists then?
Well,
Or did many become
well,
communists?
It turns out that when they first came in 1945, the communists opened up stores for their own party members. So many people joined the Communist Party, and they could get food that way and preferential treatment.
Did they maybe get more jobs?
Yes.
From being communist.
One amusing part about it is that one of our friends who's a school teacher joined the Communist Party in the hope of being able to get food. And then they had, by accident, an honest election in Budapest. And and of course the school teacher, a friend of ours, wouldn't vote for the communists. And the day after the election, he got called in by the party secretary and said, "You are expelled from the party for not voting for communists." And she said, "Why? I mean, I looked. Nobody was looking at me when I voted. How could this be?" And the party secretary said, "Well, there were no communist votes in the precinct."
What happened to the Jewish people after the communists
Yes.
came in? I know some were in safe houses during the siege and prior, I suppose, but what happened when the communists came
Well,
in?
the Jews were then they got some preferential treatment. Now you should understand that Budapest was the last place that had Jews still in the communist in the Nazi-occupied areas, and these people were in some safe houses for children, etc.
What happened with your father's factory then after the communists came in?
Well, the first thing that happened is that a so-called workers' council was established, and management was no longer under the sole jurisdiction of the executives, but it always had to be get the consent of the workers' council, and gradually more and more of the management went to the workers' council, and my father lost basically control of his company.
You had a beautiful home, a very large one. Why did you not move back to that?
Well, it was kind of demolished. The Russian military took it over, and they were totally uncivilized. For instance, these particular Russian soldiers had never seen a regular flush toilet, and they didn't even know what to do with the room because they didn't know about it. And they used the trench outside in our garden for
latrine.
Yes, and then worse, they also went up in the attic and used that as a toilet. So we never moved back.
Well, how far was the factory from the apartment building?
About 5 miles.
Mm-hmm. And your brother then was, there was no gasoline or anything, I'm sure. How did he get to work? I know he was engineer at the factory.
Well, we all, there was no public transportation right after the siege. In fact, we didn't have public transportation for about 9 months. So he had to walk 5 miles to the factory every day and came back. so he walked 10 miles every day. One day he didn't come home, and he was basically just rounded up and put into a concentration camp for eventual shipment to Russia for forced labor. But something fortunate happened, and I don't understand why. The Germans decided to counterattack. This was right at the end of the war, and they counterattacked, and the Soviet High Command wanted to make sure that these people in the camp would not become soldiers against them. So they put them to work rebuilding the railroad, and then he just escaped.
How did you feel? Because you were young, 14 years old. What were your feelings during all this time?
Well, I really don't remember too much about that. I was afraid more later on about my father being arrested, because factory owners don't fare well under the communists.
So what were you doing? You were going to school?
I was going to school. The school I was attending was about 3 miles from our home, so I would walk from there, and actually school started maybe about 2 weeks after the siege ended. The Hungarians are very scholastically minded, and so we went back to school. There were no windows in the school because they had blown out and so on. So
cold.
It was cold, and we sat there in our overcoats and so on. But school started, and on my way to the school, I would, go around dead bodies and so on. This was and one time, it was actually. I was on my way to school, and this Russian soldier came up to me and said, "You have indicated that I should wash his truck." And so I started washing his truck, but then he went back into a nearby house to get some food, and so I quickly walked away.
Oh my goodness. Were you afraid of the Russian soldiers? Because you were 14, you might have been big enough to taken to do labor or something.
Well, I looked like I was 10 or 11, so that helped. So they didn't put me to work. But it turns out that the Russians were very nice to the children. And my neighbor presently, my neighbor in Cupertino, he was in one of these Jewish children's houses. And the Russians, when they came in, they came with a filled kitchen and fed them. So they treated children very nicely, in contrast to the Nazis, that the Nazis, it didn't matter what age you were. If you were Jewish, you were an enemy.
Well, now, I do know that under this, the governing system that they had 3 types of police divisions. Would you tell about that?
Yes. Well, we had the ordinary police that you're familiar with. Then we had
to keep law and order.
Yes.
Okay.
The law and order. The other one was the second one was the economic police, and the economic police tried to take care of foreign currency. Nobody was allowed to have any foreign currency, and the penalty was death. And or black market, that was their area of watching over. And then there was the political police, and the political police was that they would jail you if you were not pro-communist easily.
What happened to the Nazis who were living in Hungary after the Russians took over and communists was going? What were the Nazis doing?
Many of them were jailed, but paradoxically, quite a few of the Nazi secret police became communist secret policemen. They already knew the
They were
trade.
trained.
Yeah, and that was the only way they could survive.
What did the Bolsheviks, what were they doing? Were many of them in the police force?
Well, yes, the Bolsheviks were quite a bit. Now, these were the people who went to Russia in 1919 and came back. Yes, they became the basically the power of the new Hungary.
So a lot of them were very brutal on the police force, where they.
Yes.
I've read where there were a lot of forced confessions from innocent people, and people were executed mainly by the Bolsheviks.
The word Bolshevik was no longer used by that time. They were called communists, but it was the same story.
The pillaging by the soldiers continued on for quite a few years, and your family wanted out.
Yes.
They didn't like it. You couldn't go out at night. It was too dangerous and so forth. So plans began for an escape. And would you tell about some of the plans you all devised and how you prepared for them? It must have been scary.
Well, it was. Luckily, it didn't just all of a sudden become communist. There was a party, the dominant party supposedly was not communist. But my father knew the handwriting on the wall. And so he made plans, first of all, to go to Switzerland. And because Hungary was so short on hard currency, he managed to convince them that he was going to bring business in to Hungary from Switzerland. So he was the first one to go. And we couldn't all leave at the same time, because the old trick of the communists was to keep at least one member of the family back there to make sure that that people don't escape. So over a period of about a year and a half, everybody quietly left.
In your family.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
My brother, and then was first after my father. Then came my sister. Then I came, and eventually my mother came.
Well, now, how did your father get the money, the currency, out of Hungary?
That was quite a deal. Just having foreign currency was punishable by death. But of course, there was lots of foreign currency there. My father managed to buy up Swiss francs and American dollars in large denominations. And so he wanted to get the currency out so he would have some way of living in Switzerland for us. So he constructed a box of plywood, but rather than using 6-ply plywood to construct the box, he made the box out of 2 sheets of 3-ply, and in between he put the currency, the American dollars, and since it was so much easier to smuggle out a single $1,000 bill than let's say $1,001 bills, what happened is that a $1,000 bill would cost much more than 1,000 individual dollars. So he got large currencies. I think he had a few $1,000 bills, which are very rare, and managed to put them into the box, and then he shipped the box to Switzerland, but he was concerned that they may examine the box very rather closely, and to make sure that nothing terrible, that he wouldn't be caught, what he did is he booked the train to depart on Sunday, and took the box with all the currency inside down to the customs house on Saturday in the morning, and they said, we don't have time to do this today, And he just said, well, okay, do it Monday, Tuesday, whenever, it's no hurry. And so the box got out and arrived in Switzerland without being opened.
Very smart man.
Yes.
Through it all.
Yes.
Well, your family was one of the wealthiest families in Budapest, and so I know that you did have some advantages. There's another man another Sabo that I interviewed a few years ago, that his family, they were okay, but they had different situations, and they had to, actually, they made several attempts to get out. They finally made it out one snowy night on foot, dodging army and guards and so forth. But it seems that your father really had it well planned. What was the excuse then that you could leave, and your brother? I mean, you had legal visas to actually leave. How did you manage that when other people had such difficult time getting
it depended when up to, let's say, 1948, you could still get a visa to leave out. The big problem was that Switzerland or any Western country wouldn't let you in unless you had money. And in my father's case, when he moved to Switzerland, he formed a company there, and the company had money, and he invited the members of his family to come under a scholarship. And so he could get out. The people later on in 48, 49, so on, had to do it, they had to basically sneak under barbed wire and machine gun towers. But we just got on the train, and it took 36 hours from Budapest to Zurich, which now takes 1/4 of that, and we just got out.
You had to cross many borders to
Yes.
get there, didn't you? Well, when did you all finally get together then? You all ended up in
Switzerland. We ended up in Switzerland in July 1948. My mother was the last one because she was in the least danger of being apprehended. And she came out in 48. It came out better than we ever hoped, but it was touch and go all the way.
Well, thanks for coming and sharing this story with us.
Thanks, Marilyn.